Violence and unrest have erupted across Serbia once again, and this time things have escalated far beyond street chants and banners. In the last 11 hours, according to reports by BBC News, protesters in the city of Valjevo set fire to the local headquarters of the Serbian Progressive Party, the ruling political party led by President Aleksandar Vučić. Eyewitness footage shows flames breaking through the windows and thick smoke rising into the night sky as stunned police and bystanders look on. The building was empty at the time of the attack, but moments later riot police flooded the surrounding streets. Authorities used stun grenades and tear gas in an attempt to disperse the crowds. What's important to understand is that this isn't an isolated act of vandalism, it's part of what has now become the fifth straight night of anti-government protest in Serbia. Demonstrators say they are tired of corruption, misinformation, and political intimidation. What started as a peaceful movement has now evolved into something far more volatile. The latest wave of protests can be traced back to November of last year, when a railway station collapsed in Novi Sad, killing 16 people. Many Serbians blame the tragedy on poor construction standards and widespread corruption linked directly to President Vučić's government and the private contractors his party allegedly protects. That tragedy quickly became a national symbol of mismanagement, and hundreds of thousands of people began marching in what were initially peaceful anti-corruption rallies. But everything changed this week. On Wednesday, large groups of pro-government loyalists staged counter-protests in an attempt to disrupt the demonstrators. That single move caused tensions to explode. In Belgrade, Novi Sad and Valjevo, police moved in with full riot gear. There are now numerous reports, and several unverified videos circulating on social media, showing police officers beating protesters on the ground. One particular video from Valjevo shows a man being struck repeatedly with batons while already restrained. The Serbian Interior Ministry has denied all allegations of excessive force, saying that officers are only responding to violent groups who are putting public safety at risk. At the same time, the anger of protesters has become more targeted. Not only have they called for early elections, they've also started focusing on physical symbols of the current government. Flags belonging to Vučić's Serbian Progressive Party were pulled down and set alight. Protesters smashed the windows of the Serbian Radical Party headquarters, a coalition partner of the ruling government. And now, as seen in Valjevo overnight, entire party offices are being set on fire. International human rights observers are beginning to take notice. Michael O'Flaherty, the Commissioner for Human Rights at the Council of Europe, released a statement Friday warning that the Serbian police appear to be using disproportionate force and calling on authorities to immediately stop arbitrary arrests and to de-escalate before someone is killed. President Vučić, however, is doubling down. In a post published on his official Instagram account on Saturday, the president wrote that violence is an expression of total weakness and promised that those involved would be identified and punished. He has also repeatedly rejected calls for early elections, claiming that the unrest is part of a foreign-backed plot to remove him from power. Even more striking, Russia has now stepped directly into the situation. The Russian Foreign Ministry issued an official statement of support for President Vučić, saying it cannot remain unresponsive to what is happening in brotherly Serbia. Moscow also defended the Serbian police, stating that officers were using lawful methods and means to control what they called violent mobs, while insisting that public order, security and human lives were at risk. For many Serbians, the involvement of Russia only confirms a larger fear, that their internal struggle is becoming part of a wider geopolitical game. Protests have now been reported in Belgrade, Novi Sad, Kragujevac and Valjevo, almost daily, since the Novi Sad railway station collapse. What began as a demand for a transparent investigation has grown into an urgent cry for new elections and the end of Vučić's 12-year rule. At their peak this past week, the demonstrations have drawn hundreds of thousands of people out onto the streets. With party headquarters now in flames and riot police positioned in almost every major square in the country, analysts say Serbia may have entered the most dangerous phase of civil unrest it has faced in more than a decade. Opposition leaders are warning that the next 48 hours could determine whether the situation turns toward dialogue, or spirals into even more confrontations. European leaders were caught completely off guard this week and have rushed to the United States in a last-minute diplomatic effort to prevent what some officials are now openly calling a possible capitulation of Ukraine. Less than 24 hours after President Donald Trump returned from his meeting with Vladimir Putin in Alaska, France's Emmanuel Macron, Italy's Giorgia Meloni, and the UK's Sir Keir Starmer abruptly cleared their schedules and boarded flights to Washington, D.C. According to diplomats close to the talks, none of them were planning to visit the United States this week. Macron was on holiday in the French Riviera and had reportedly been spotted paddleboarding on the coast just 2 days ago. Meloni was in Greece attending private meetings, and European Union officials were operating under the assumption that the next high-level discussions on Ukraine would not take place until late next month. But that changed, almost overnight, after Trump's surprise decision to drop calls for a ceasefire as a condition for peace talks with Russia. That shift, European officials say, completely undermines months of coordinated Western strategy and risks forcing Ukraine to accept territorial concessions without any guarantees of long-term security. One senior French diplomat put it this way: "It's not just about avoiding a confrontation anymore. It's about avoiding a total capitulation." They add that the real concern is not a breakdown in negotiations, it's that the United States is slowly sliding toward a position that mirrors Moscow's demands. Sources say the alarms really began ringing after the Alaska summit, when reporters asked Donald Trump about new economic sanctions against Russia, and he simply stated that he had no intention of imposing any, even if a ceasefire deal fails. That comment alone, European diplomats say, shifted the entire playing field. In a single weekend, 4 high-level conference calls were held among NATO leaders, followed by a 5th one involving both the European Union and the UK. The most senior officials agree on one thing: Europe can't let this moment define the post-war balance. They argue that if Trump pushes for a land-for-peace deal, allowing Russia to permanently keep parts of Donbass, the entire security of the European continent could be threatened. Or in the words of Emmanuel Macron, there is only one state proposing a peace that would be a capitulation, and that is Russia. For context, until Friday, the Western position had been crystal clear: no peace negotiations until a ceasefire was in place. It was a red line designed to stop Russia from simply using diplomacy as a tactical pause. But on Friday afternoon, after leaving Alaska, Trump abruptly changed course and suggested that the war could end through direct negotiations, without a preliminary ceasefire. That alarmed European officials, particularly in London and Paris, who feel Russia could use that kind of opening to permanently split Ukraine and neuter its military power. One British diplomat put it bluntly: "This isn't just about Ukraine. This is about the security of our entire continent." They explain that any future peace agreement has to include genuine, hard security guarantees, not symbolic pledges. The fear in European capitals is that Trump may believe that a verbal warning to Russia, saying, "Don't attack Ukraine again," is enough. But from their point of view, and especially from Kiev's point of view, that isn't a guarantee at all. That's just a statement. Officials say this is why Macron, Meloni and Starmer changed travel plans so suddenly. It's also why the delegation arriving today in Washington is larger and more unconventional than normal. One European official privately described it as unwieldy, noting that some leaders disagree on how much Europe should commit to Ukraine's long-term security, even though they all agree that any land swap deal must only happen after a ceasefire, not before. Behind the scenes, the leaders are hoping to persuade the White House to slow the pace of talks, reintroduce a ceasefire as a prerequisite, and focus first on general principles, like Ukraine's right to defend itself and the idea that future peace cannot come at the expense of European security. Some diplomats are trying to build support for a 3-way summit involving Trump, Zelensky, and Putin, arguing that anything less might end up sidelining Ukraine completely. The real risk today is that Trump sees this rush of European leaders as an attempt to pressure him, and decides to walk away from the table. According to one advisor, there is concern that, if the Europeans push too hard, Trump might think he's being bullied, and everything could collapse in the room. That is why today's meetings are expected to focus less on demands, and more on defining the framework of talks, laying out the minimum points needed before any negotiations can even begin. European leaders also want to avoid what they're calling an accidental agreement, where something is said or suggested in the room and suddenly becomes a baseline expectation, even if it hasn't been formally negotiated. Several officials pointed to the fact that Trump floated the idea of Ukraine giving up Donbass in exchange for peace, even though no Ukrainian official has ever endorsed that concept. For Europe, that's a major red line. Their message to the White House today is reportedly very simple: territory and security guarantees cannot be separated, and any peace agreement must offer real, enforceable protection, not empty words. What remains unclear is whether these leaders can actually change Trump's mind, or whether they've simply arrived too late. One official told the BBC, "Things have moved very fast. Nobody expected it. The US clearly wants to act quickly." But we need to slow things down before a serious mistake is made. As one final sign of just how serious this is, sources say that if today's talks in Washington fail, France and the UK are ready to call an emergency session of the NATO Council, something that hasn't happened in more than a decade. That's how high the stakes are.